Welcome to the Recover You podcast. I'm Kylene.
And I'm Patrick.
We are a couple in recovery
from sex addiction
and betrayal trauma. Together, we share our story to encourage you on your journey. It's here that we talk about sex addiction, betrayal trauma, mental, emotional, and physical health, faith, and anything and everything needed to recover you to your most authentic self that God created you to be. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Recover You. We have a guest on today, and we're going to be discussing the topic around the younger generation, specifically Gen Z, their access to pornography and how it impacts lives. And of course, we're also going to talk about, what we can do about that and how we can help them.
So our guest today is Casey Freeman. Casey and I have known each other for about 3 years now.
Yes, sir.
And so Casey and I have had the good fortune to be in groups together. And so Casey's a 25-year-old youth pastor at Centerville Grace Church in Dayton, Ohio. He enjoys investing into the next generation of God's kingdom. Outside of work, he's a big car guy, enjoys nerdy stuff like Legos and video games. I like Legos too.
There you go.
And the outdoors. He is engaged and looking forward to starting a life with his fiancée, Megan. His life verse is 2 Timothy 4:7. I fought the good fights. I've finished the race. I've kept the faith. This verse is in alignment with his goal to feel satisfied at the end of his life, knowing that not only has he kept the faith, but he's pushed others to the faith. So welcome, Casey.
I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, we're excited to have you. So if you could start with maybe a brief summary of your journey and how you ended up in the chair today, relative.
Yeah. Well, in connection to the younger generation, I think my journey with pornography started really, really young. In fact, I was thinking this past week as I was like, okay, the podcast is coming up. What do I need to say about my story? I actually had a moment that popped up in my head that I realized, I'm actually I was really, really young. So I was about 6 years old. And how it went is as a kid, I was always a nerdy guy. And as a kid, I loved Power Rangers. And I remember going on this pirated website to watch an episode of I think it was Dino Thunder or something. That doesn't matter. But in watching it, I remember looking off to the side, so I'm about 6 or 7, looking into the recommended feed, and there was actually a pornographic video recommended. And it showed nudity, and I was mortified because I grew up in the church. I knew some things about sex, but I was experiencing emotions in that particular moment as a 6 and 7 year old that did not need to be occurring. At any point in anyone's life, but especially as so young. And I'm actually pretty standard when it comes to that. When we look at trends and statistics, about I think it's 93% of anybody under the age of 18, specifically males, will have been exposed to pornography. And then I think it's 62% of females under the age of 18. By the time they reach the age of 18, they will have seen pornography. And about half of those are all involuntary. And so I look at my journey, and I was involuntary, but I was also way younger than the average age. The average age is about 9 to 11 years old. So you're talking 3 years earlier. And I was an overweight kid, right? And so being one of the trends that occurs when you're overweight is you kick into puberty earlier. And so I was about 8 years old, I think, when puberty and sexual curiosity hit. So I have this exposure when I'm 6 or 8 years old, or 6 or 7 years old, and by 8 or 9 years old, I started being homeschooled. And in that era of homeschooling, it was just, here's a laptop, figure it out, no blockers, no nothing, no protections, because it was kind of we weren't the Wild West of the late 90s of the internet, but we were still Web 2.0, so it's still unknown. And my mother, she's a boomer. My dad is a Gen X. And so they were just we don't get this stuff. We don't know what's going on. We don't know how to guide, how to protect. And so by 8 years old, when the sexual curiosities start kicking in, I started searching for it. And I ended up finding it on YouTube, believe it or not, which I actually think is the standard place most kids find it nowadays, is from YouTube Shorts and YouTube Reels.
Because they're on there looking for games or different things, and then it's on a little profile photo next to it or something, or recommended.
I have some boys that I talk to regularly right now, and they're it's hard where I'll just be searching through videos, and then boom, a video pops up in the recommended feed, and it's a thumbnail that's very provocative, or because it's not quite pornography, right? It's softcore pornography. And so that's what I was exposed to. And that just then led me to Google and down the rabbit trail. And when when I started getting curious, my dad, he busted me, as the classic story goes. And because I just didn't know that you could clear your search history. I didn't figure that out as an 8-year-old. I figured it out as a 9-year-old, and that was dangerous. But how it kind of led is I was like, okay, well, I just can't be on the family computer. And I guess this is just done for me. The danger for my generation, I think for most people that are young, is how they're getting exposed as video game consoles. So I was like, believe it or not, the Nintendo Wii, the PlayStation 3, the Xbox 360, we had one of each. And if I wasn't watching it on one, I was watching it on another.
So for parents who don't understand how that might happen, is it because those have access to the internet and so you can sort of get to it in a different way, kind of behind the scenes?
Yeah, it breaks my heart and it drives me nuts that why are we putting private web browsers with no really good parental control system on something that's targeted towards children? It's no wonder kids are getting exposed so early. It's like it just like when I remember when I really like started pushing hard into the journey and when I started joining groups, one of my real last times where I fell was my laptop was locked down well, my phone was locked down well. Well, I had my PlayStation 4 on me and I got curious. And they used to have a really strong system in there where you just punch in a code and you couldn't access the web browser anymore. For some reason, Sony got rid of that. I remember actually being hurt. Like I had an emotional feeling of like, wow, you kind of betrayed me here. And so that kind of winding back to my story is I got really into it as a result of game consoles. And then probably by like 13, 14 years old, I had a private computer in my bedroom. It was just like a desktop. And I mean, no restrictors, no nothing, have fun. And
when did your dad first catch you? You said you were like really young?
Yeah. So I was about 8 years old.
So you had a computer later though in your room by yourself?
Yeah. So there was like the family computer in the living room. And then I was homeschooled. And so I had a laptop, but like I couldn't use a laptop upstairs. And then 13, 14, I'm like, hey, I really want to get into music production. Can I have this? And can I have this in my room? And they're like, yeah, sure. And I give a ton of grace to my parents in this because they just didn't know.
Yeah,
they did not know how to.
Did they have any conversations with you around sexuality?
They tried, but they just. My dad has a background where, and I've told you this story before, Pat, where pornography was like everywhere in the home. And there's this story I always hear of my aunt who had married my uncle. She caught him with a Playboy in his briefcase. This would have been like the mid 80s, early 90s. And she's like freaking out. And she's complaining to my mother or my grandmother. And my grandmother's response was, well, that's just what boys do, right? Because that's what my grandfather did. He'd walk around with a Playboy in his briefcase. So when at the same time I got busted watching pornography, at the same time my older brother got busted watching pornography. And my dad had no idea what to do. So my dad was maybe a Christian 5 or 10 years old by the time he had us. So he was still relatively young in his faith. And a lot of his response was just like, hey, you shouldn't do this. Try not to do this. But he was kind of scared to navigate that conversation because his background was just like, yeah, it's whatever. So he's dealing with his own like philosophies on life and how to manage that. And I definitely got a perception from the church that I was in. It was kind of legalistic nature. If you want to be in the grace of Jesus, you got to be living right. And it basically pushed me further and further into pornography. So by the time I'm a freshman in high school, I have a full-blown daily use pornographic addiction. Like 14 years old, can't drive, partway through puberty. Like that, it's so sad for me when I look back and I think about myself and I'm like, man, I just want to give that guy a hug. Because like that's not something somebody should be wrapped up in so young and forming a lot of my understandings of sex and philosophy of life off of watching pornography. And I actually remember, and this is kind of a newer stat, I think it's like 54% of kids say that they kind of learn how to have sex as a result of watching pornography. And pornography's horrendously like violent and misogynistic towards women. And I remember actually having that same thought as like I was a 7th grader, like, well, you know what, at least I'm learning how to have sex. Like, I'm not learning how to have sex. I'm learning how to have sexual fantasy about things that aren't real. And so what ends up happening is I went to a pretty prominent youth group that was very comfortable about talking about pornography. I had a youth pastor who'd gotten over an addiction. His name's Rob. He's an awesome guy. And he just constantly pushed us like, guys, you don't want this in your life. This ruins your life. This hurts your life. He's like, this hurt my marriage for a long time. And I remember in a moment where I was almost 16, and I went, you know what? I don't want this in my life, but I don't know how to get it out of my life. And I realized for me to get it out of my life, I actually needed to turn to Jesus. And so I actually got saved as a result of realizing I couldn't follow, or I couldn't get out of it if I didn't have Jesus. But even in that, I don't think I was taking the fight very seriously. And so it was basically started following Jesus, trying to grow in him, and then going through kind of a binge purge cycle from 16 years old to almost 22 years old. And I went through a pretty gnarly breakup for me in going into my senior year of college. And that kind of woke me up. I was like, man, I'm experiencing such an immense amount of pain, and I don't know how to process this. And I don't feel like I've ever been taught how to process this. And I don't want to turn to pornography to cope through this. And I think that's really where Jesus started meeting me when it came to pornography and helping me walk away from it. And I remember I get dumped, and then I go on my first month streak that I'd ever been on, because I really perceived that the reason we broke up was because this pornographic issue that was in my life.
She found out, or she knew?
No, she never knew.
Okay.
That was the crazy part. She never knew that was a part
You just thought it was impacting you.
Yeah, negatively. I just knew it was impacting me. And I ended up going on a Wild at Heart retreat. John Elderidge wrote, fantastic book. I recommend it to anybody, any guy that's listening. And I, in that retreat, realized, I'm like, man, this is blocking me from my woundedness. This is my crutch, and I need to find a way to navigate out of it. And so my senior year of college was the first time, and it's ironic, my senior year of Bible college was the first time I really started fighting and being I need to be as intentional as I can be to get away from this. Mm-hmm. And there were just so many good moments and good victories and learning myself. And it was the first time I ever went to counseling, because I had a lot of background hurt with the church and with family that I just had not been processing. And it's I'm basically limping and not realizing I have a broken leg that I need to work on. And the grace of Christ that just met me in that season, that was able to help me start going strong. And I ended up becoming the youth pastor here at Centerville Grace, and was really enjoying that, and was going on another long streak, but I was still doing it by myself. And that's you just can't do it by yourself. And I had that fall where it was a game console. It was the old PlayStation 4 that messed me up. And I remember I text my dad, because they were on vacation. I was at home because I'm up from Akron, Ohio. And I text my dad. I said, hey, I know you're on vacation right now. I just want to let you know I left my PlayStation 4 at home. I don't care what you do with it. I don't want it anymore, because there's no way for me to protect myself. And then I think I ended up emailing you and being like, hey man, I'd love to come check out the Conquer group. And it's just been an incredible journey on the back end. So it's been over 2 years now that I've been just walking in freedom, and it's solely because of Christ that I can walk in that freedom. And I just have so much more joy in life, and so much more self-control and ability to say no to things, even beyond pornography, and learn a lot more about myself, and learn more about the Lord, and how my woundedness can drive me away from him, and how I don't want that to occur. And it was really fun. 6 months after I started really being in groups and going through that I ended up meeting my fiance, Megan. And I was very vocal at that point, where I'm like, yeah, I've been clean. I've been sober, away from pornography. And she was excited about that, because she comes from a background where dad used it and had boyfriends that used it. And so for her to be like, oh, this is new. This is a guy who not only is away from it, but he's open about being away from it. And I don't have to ask that dreaded question, hey, are you struggling with pornography as a Christian male? And so that's just that has brought so much more richness and joy into our relationship. And because I've learned how to communicate as a result of getting rid of pornography, because I'm learning my own emotion and what's going on in there. Hey, why am I triggered right now? Why am I feeling tempted? And then that kind of leads into other things of okay, Megan, Like, here's how I'm feeling. I think I can see this is how you're feeling right now. And so it's just like, she lives in Philadelphia and I live here in Dayton. And we've made this joke that like the forearm of communication when we get married is going to be like the buffest muscle on our body. Cause you just got to communicate all the time in a long distance situation. And I found just a lot of joy and a lot of goodness as a result of just eliminating pornography. And the biggest way possible is being with her, and then also in a ministry sense. All my discipleship groups where I'm meeting with like 2 to 3 boys at a time, other than one, have transformed into groups where we're just talking about that right now. So we're just saying, hey guys, I recognize you're like younger brothers to me. You're 15, you're 16 years old. I already developed my addiction by 14. How can I help like encourage and guide you guys as like a big brother right now? And just be like, hey, like I spent my early 20s dealing with this. I don't want you to spend your early 20s dealing with this. What can we do here? And so it's been fun that like, not only has Christ given me freedom, but then he's given me an excitement and a drive to then try to help others out of it, which is kind of, it's the shift that happens. It's why you guys have this podcast. Like you've gone through the recovery and now you're like, well, how can I give back, Lord? How can I live this out? Because you've given me such a deep freedom that I want others to experience that freedom. So
I'm curious about how, if this has impacted your dad and his perspective around this. So like coming from a kind of, as you were explaining, like the generation where you don't really know how to handle it, to having him find you, but then also you be so vocal about what recovery looks like, and then also giving the gaming system back. Like, what was his response to all of that?
My dad loves it. He's excited. He's proud. There's a moment when I got busted, and that when I was about 8 years old, I remember he caught me. And his response was, it's a good thing I caught you and not your mother, because I'd be the one that's in trouble right now. And so that created a little bit of a rift. I noticed even in my 20s, I'm like, I'm noticing some weird trust issues between me and my dad. And so I remember I approached him and I was like, hey, like this moment happened. Can we talk about this? And there was there was a deep joy that occurred as a result of that moment where I got to learn about my family history. Like I didn't know the story about like the briefcase and the Playboys until I had that conversation with my dad and learned more about my family history. And my dad loved it because he's like, your mom was the first woman I ever met that hated porn. She didn't want anything to do with it. She wanted it nowhere near our home, near our lives. And as a result of now me being like, yeah, I want to walk in freedom from this. And my dad really hasn't had struggles with it, even though he comes from a background where it was just prevalent. Like my mom came in and it's like, you're watching this, you're not in my life. And my dad was like, all right, that's enough. I don't need it. And so for him, as a result, to like see me walk in this, I think it's been cool for him to see and try to understand a bit and just be like, more than anything, he's always just like, I'm proud of you. I'm proud of you where you're at. So I think that kind of gives you an overview of that question and the impact it's had. I think it's just strengthened in his relationship a lot.
You actually said something when you were talking, you used the phrase that the use of pornography blocked you from your woundedness. And I thought that was a really interesting phrase. And, I know all the groups you've been through because I've walked those paths myself, but hearing you say this blocked me from my woundedness is interesting because I think you had said that realization came a little bit earlier. Whereas I think most people who are addicted to pornography or sex or whatever, they just feel like the path out is to just stop.
Yeah.
And so what's interesting in I guess the question I would have for you is, how do you think, or what was it that allowed you to maybe make that connection before you got into groups, but that was a little bit of a realization for you?
Yeah. That's a big question for
Sorry.
my process. No, I appreciate it. Like what made that connection.
Yeah.
I think there's an element of the uniqueness of my generation. So like, any Gen Z person, Zoomer or whatever they call us, they're going to be like, oh yeah, I really care about mental health. Right. And I think I could be in that train of thought too. I think my tension though is how I perceive my generation is like, oh yeah, we care about mental health. We care about being good. I think we care about living out our mental health, like staying in the problem rather than dealing with it. I come from a rural background. Like you got a problem, you fix it. I'm looking at it like I'm depressed. I'm anxious. I'm feeling lonely. I'm struggling to make friends. I'm struggling to keep relationships. Like there's a problem here. We need to work on this.
What do you think helped you make the correlation that those things were a result of that behavior?
I feel like I always knew. I mean, I grew up in the church, right? So the churches that I grew up in were like aware, like, hey, this isn't good. They were vocal about it. And so like I knew that it was the problem. I just really couldn't perceive or understand. You know, it's like there seems to just be a lot of like cognitive development that occurs between 18 to even 25, right? And I look at that and I could not understand how it was affecting me as a 16-year-old. I couldn't understand how it was affecting me as an 18-year-old, but I knew there was an effect there. I couldn't understand it as a 20-year-old, but I understood more of an effect. By about 22, it's like, oh my gosh, this is like really hitting me. This is really affecting my life. And I think it's from going through Conquer, from going through sex addiction counseling, I realized I'm like, this is my coping mechanism. This is what's pushing me away from healing. This is keeping me more in it. And so I think there's a blend of like being in the generation that I am in, of like, hey, we care about mental health. Being a rural background where it's like, hey, if there's a problem, you've got to fix it. And then the third piece is I grew up in a church that was just like, this negatively affects your life. You don't want to have this in your life.
Yeah, as a Gen Z guy, nobody talked about anything, right? We didn't talk about feelings.
You're a Gen Z guy, or?
Hey, you just said as a Gen Z guy.
I'm a Gen X guy, sorry. But I mean, nobody talked about anything. I had early exposure too, but it was to the printed form. And, as you work with, because I don't work with a lot of youth the way you do, and you're kind of in that moment where you're starting to move into another, there's another generation coming up behind you. What do you think the differences are with some of the early teen youth? Is there a difference to what they're being exposed to, or how they're being
between your generation, his generation, and the next generation?
Right. Yeah.
Yes.
Right, yeah.
Okay. So the difference so we're basically talking Gen X, maybe we can throw millennial in there, Gen Z, and then Gen Alpha, who's coming after us.
Yeah.
So I mean, Gen X, right? Like you guys didn't talk about it, but it also wasn't like you had to go to a book, you had to go to a store to buy it, right? Like it was like I imagine your exposure was maybe the classic story of like the buddy being like, dude, my dad's got a stack back home. We got to go check it out.
Right.
So my generation, when we're looking at Gen Z, is it's like, why look at the stack back home when the stack's in your pocket? And the tension I see for me and for a lot of my group is, the old saying is, you don't put an alcoholic in a bar, right? We're walking around with bars in our pocket. And that's like so hard to manage and learn and grow through that. Like even just last week, I stumbled across a website that I was concerned about. And so I had to like take it to my accountability partner and be like, hey, I need you to punch the code into my cell phone and my computer so I can add this to the block list. And so it's an element of like learning how to like manage that. So like the difference between like Gen Z and Gen X, right? Is we just had it everywhere. Like had it on game consoles. Like there's no reason that there are internet browsers. There should be no reason why there should be internet browsers on gaming consoles. On the Oculus Quests, I was really bummed when I figured out there was no way to block the internet browser on those, because I have a long distance girlfriend. I was going to buy 2 cheap on Marketplace, and we were going to hang out and just have virtual dates and kind of do fun things. And then I realized there's no form of parental control on this whatsoever. Like Meta has one of the worst forms of parental controls, which makes sense. They own Instagram, they own Facebook. They're just kind of over that conglomerate. And so it's just like the old saying, kind of, or not the old saying, but kind of like Thanos, he's inevitable. Pornography is inevitable for my generation. That's the difference, I think, between your generation and my generation, is you could have easily gotten to 18 years old without having viewed it, unless you went out of your way to try to find it. My generation, it's just like, you scroll through YouTube long enough, you scroll through Instagram long enough, you're going to get some type of either pornographic exposure or softcore sexual in nature pornographic exposure. or even just television, like I really enjoy watching anime, and a lot of my generation is starting to get more into anime, which, are you aware what anime is? Or, okay. Yeah. Wasn't sure, but, so, like they have the term called fan service on that. And so it's just like, it's, basically just super provocative characters. That was something I had to learn how to manage, was like, I can't watch this show right now. It's deeply triggering for me. And so it's the inevitable nature of pornography is everywhere for my group. And then I think of Gen Alpha that's coming up after me. I think it's like, it's going to be even harder for them because of the development of AI. Like my students are already dealing with like AI stuff. I have 6th graders who mom came and talked to me and they're like, hey, they're like having dirty conversations with an AI boyfriend or girlfriend right now. And I'm like, you're what? You serious? And I get worried about like for the next gen, as we have further development in AI and the ability to have like what seems like genuine conversations with artificial intelligence, and the mix of as augmented reality becomes more of a thing. So you have like Apple with the Apple Vision, I think, is that what it's called? And so as VR becomes cheaper and more prevalent, as pornography and AI personalities become more prevalent. And then I also think with a mix of like gender distaste towards each other, like men and women don't seem to get along as much nowadays, that you just have a recipe for pushing a whole generation into that way of life.
What's interesting is you're talking about AI. What came to my head was, we people seek out relationship, and unfortunately, maybe in broken homes, there's no great modeling of relationship. So AI can
even in not broken homes,
right? So AI, in a sense, can create this false sense of relationship because it's so responsive.
Yeah,
and how dangerous that can be, because then it there's always obviously health in relationship. So it's a false. It doesn't even exist, but they're getting that same sense of relationship.
Yeah. Well, and I think on a positive side, so I know I sent you that podcast the other day about like basically the downfall of Pornhub right now. I don't know if you guys have heard, but like 90% of the website has been deleted just due to like trafficking and sexual abuse. And, I grew up in the era of like, it's like the 60s and 70s were kind of like when cigarettes were, it's fine, it won't hurt you, it won't harm you, or maybe like the 50s and 60s and the 70s is when people were like, this actually isn't great. And I think I grew up in the 50s and 60s of pornography, where like, it's just, hey, it's whatever, it won't cause any harm. And now we're like 20, 30 years removed, almost pushing 40 years of internet pornography, where it's like, there's a lot of data here that this messes people up. Like this hurts or raises divorce rates. This raises mental health issues. And
I think there's the technology boom, and then essentially 20, 30 years after that, people recognizing all that extreme exposure, and then people having all this constant exposure to it, then they see the inevitable fallout of it, because it's had the time now to like be on a higher scale and for people to see what the heck is happening.
Yeah. There's a book I'm reading right now. It's decently popular. It's called The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. And he makes the argument that Generation Z won't end until we get phones out of like generation's hands for children. I mean, just due to there's so much that goes on in like cognitive development that you like need interaction with humans and not with a phone and with a machine. That I think that the positive side that I was trying to go to there is that we see a lot more people being noisy about like, this isn't great. Like we see 25-year-olds like me and 30-year-olds and people, guys in my generation who are like being like, hey, this isn't great.
Well, even secular.
I mean,
coming out
you've
now.
got companies like Reboot and companies like Fight the New Drug and Your Brain on Porn. Like these are secularism, because of course Christianity started out first being like, this probably isn't good. We don't know why it isn't good, but it probably isn't good. And then secular culture has come around and been like, this really isn't good, especially for children. We need to get children off of this. And so my fear for the next generation, for Gen Alpha, is that if things aren't addressed, it'll be even worse for them. that their ability to connect relationally will be even way worse than it was for me and for other people in my generation. But I think there are enough parents complaining. There are enough people out there that like want deep, radical cultural change. I mean, I think that's what we're going through a lot right now is everybody like wants like everything just torn down to the studs and rebuilt. And it's just kind of where our culture is shifting to right now that I think there's a chance that as more states like Texas take up the charge of like, hey, we need to be keeping kids off of social media. We need to be keeping kids out of like pornography, that I think there's maybe not Gen Alpha. They might still be getting a decent amount of fallout, but potentially the group after them where there's enough like data and parents crying out to be like, all right, like we need to eviscerate this from children. We need to leave this as an adult decision. You know, when you turn 21 years old, go smoke and drink and vote for whoever you want. It doesn't matter. It's not like you're an adult. You've been raised. You should be able to make your own choices. But as somebody who's like developing and growing up, it's like I think the protection in secular culture as they're pushing more and more towards that will hopefully help out in the long run.
I think what's key to your origin story, as you told it, was you had a voice, and that was your youth group that was talking about this in an open way. And a lot of people don't have that. And hopefully, as both the secular side and the religious side starts to speak up more on this, that there is a message. Because I know that was not, I was actually thinking as you were telling your story, I was like, I don't think I had a meaningful conversation about pornography or sex addiction until after I was discovered. So I was 49 years old. You know what I mean? And you were, and nobody ever spoke about it.
Yeah.
There was no, at least in the areas where I was exposed to. So I think, unfortunately and I know this has been kind of a depressing thing for me at times. I'll think about all these great people that have just come into my groups and found healing. And then occasionally I'll get depressed thinking about the kids that are getting addicted, and you're kind of like, oh, this is kind of a never-ending battle. But it does help because what was centered or what was incredibly encouraging for you, it provided you a little bit of a North Star while you struggled, was you had some good perspective coming at you. And so I think that's just a really important thing for the people who are listening, like speak openly and boldly about it. People are listening, even though they may be addicted.
I think to that point too, just really highlighting the point that if you're a parent listening to this, it's incredibly important to have an ongoing conversation with your children about this, like over and over and over and over and over. You didn't really talk to anybody about it until you were 49, but also before I found out that you were struggling with stuff, I was having you have these conversations with Keegan, sort of assuming and trusting that you knew how to do it, right? And me not personally being involved in that. And so I think there's a couple things here. One, the conversation should be super open, but the only way that that's going to be, I don't want to say the only way, the best way that that's going to be the most effective is if you're also dealing with your own stuff. So having that handled first. And so the reason I think this is important to talk about, because a lot of people will get into recovery and then they still feel really nervous talking to their kids about it.
Yeah.
And they still feel really, I don't want my kids to know everything that I've done. I don't want to, I think there's a little bit of a fear of like exposing them through the conversation and, just different things like that. And I could not disagree with that more. To Casey's point, they're going to be exposed.
Yeah.
So it's going to be safer having a conversation with you to kind of go against the idea of like, well, what if they know everything about me? The more vulnerability you can have in parenting, the more trust you're going to build. And if you can share your story with your children from a place of dealing with it and being in recovery and having some experience and being able to guide them and love them through it, it's a totally different perspective than almost, not to throw you under the bus, Patrick, but to basically go in and pretend like you don't have an issue and then be like, just don't do it. You know what I mean? It's a different conversation.
Oh yeah. I can't really remember them in detail, but the conversation that I had with Keegan before, it was about the most superficial of superficial conversations you could ever have versus the conversation I have with him now where I'll say, hey, how are you doing with that? And then we talk about his emotions. You know what I mean? Like it's a level of conversation that I have with him that I never had with my father. That I, and my father loved me. I don't doubt that. But
and I'll throw myself
equipped.
under the bus too, because this should be both parents being involved in that.
That's right.
And so I just sort of like left it up to you. Thought, the dad can talk to the son, but for whoever's listening, two parents, both should have these conversations very, very openly, very frequently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and it's a balancing act, right? Like, remember, like, the maturities you're dealing with. So, like, Keegan's 20 years old, so you can have those adult conversations with him. Right. And I'm sure as a byproduct of that is Keegan feels very close to you. He feels like he can trust you. He feels very loved with you. Like, my conversation I had with my dad, where I was like, hey, like, why did you say what you said to me when I was 8 years old? Like, has led to more vulnerability and trust and communication with me and him. And it's kind of, but on the flip side, it's like learning how to communicate that. So it's, I think one of my faults of my parents was them trying to like manage it to where nobody talked about it.
Right.
Like, they talked about it maybe too open and too maybe detailed. Right. And so it's like learning the age levels of like, okay, well, I'm talking to a 4-year-old right now. How much do they need to know? Do they need to know anything? Because it's inevitable. Do I want them to hear it from school and from YouTube, which they should not be on, or their friends, or do I want them to hear it in some capacity in a trusted space, even if it's just lightly touched? And then, but then thinking about, all right, well, my daughter's 12 years old, and this is close to around the average age of exposure for girls. Like, how can I help navigate and talk to her about this? And so it's like learning the maturity hikes of it.
We always recommend the book, Good Pictures, Bad Pictures. They have 2 different age ranges and kind of help parents with that. But I think part of what's nice about that is you're probably going to be reading books to your kids anyway, when they're 6, 7, 8, 9, and it gives you the words at an age appropriate level, so that it opens the door for them to come and ask you questions. So that, I think giving the parents the words, especially when, like me, until all this happened, like I just felt super awkward talking about all that stuff. So being handed like the conversational tools in a resource like that, but then also by reading it, giving the children the words. I was in situations when I was a kid that I literally did not have the words to communicate to my parents in a way that they would have really understood up until a certain point. And so I think the books are really great resources for that. It gives the children the words that, like, how do you tell your parents that something is happening or that something did happen? And then also the parents, like, how do you open these conversations? So tools like that are great.
Yeah, they're super helpful. I mean, that's kind of what I do with students right now. So I'm just outsourcing curriculum from something else, because I can write this up on my own and I can make some things, but like, no need to reinvent the wheel, right? No need to reinvent the wheel. And the cool thing is, like, one I've been helping students through recently is called Needed Navigation by Noah Filipak, I think is how you say his last name. And I think I've told you about this resource too. It's been great because it's super short, to the point, and it's been helpful for me to then, like, walk my students through, but also like female students can walk through it too.
Nice.
And so one of my parents, she's like, yeah, I'm walking my daughter through this, even though I'm walking her son through the resource right now. She's like, my daughter needs a space too. Well, I'm going to be the space for my daughter right now.
Right.
I was, as you're talking about that, I think about the old model, which is you discover your kids looking at it, they're in trouble, they're grounded, they're whatever. I think what we're speaking through a little bit now is like the culture and society and pornography is almost bullying your kids. So if you think about how you would help your kid through something that let's say they were being bullied at school, it's a different approach. It's, you love them, you support them, you build them up. And I think that it seems like that's a better thread to navigate children through. It's like, hey, you need help with this. You're not going to be in trouble. We're actually going to, because like you said, exposure is inevitable.
Yeah.
And where could it come from? And sometimes well-intentioned parents will put all the blockers in the world and do all of that stuff, and then bang, there's an opening. Yeah. And it may not even be at the house. It may be on the school bus, or it may be, any of those, because I think they even say that the school buses are like horrible places, because that's where a lot of kids get exposed.
Yeah, because even if you lock down your kid's phone and you give them a Gap phone, their friends are probably still going to have iPhones. Right. They're still going to be able to show them things. And so, and I'm not a proponent against blocking things, because all my stuff's locked down, right? I'm for it. I even I had struggles where I was concerned. There was a TV, like my roommates had a TV that had a private internet browser, and I'm like, I don't want to mess with this. Do you guys mind if I go buy another TV? Right. And so I'm like, this is coming from a guy who's a big proponent of blocking. Like, why the best way for me to fight is to not like have to fight the temptation. And so, but in that, like, you shouldn't also avoid the conversation. Right. You should be open and talk and encourage. And I think that's like one of the best pieces from my childhood is, even though my parents, they were like really not sure what they were doing, they weren't from environments that talked about it, they gave it a shot. They gave it a shot. Yeah. They were comfortable. Yeah. They were open about it. And I think that's a big part of like why I'm able to walk in freedom now, why I'm so comfortable to talk about it, is because really I look back, I'm like, man, the Lord blessed me with a great youth group. He blessed me with some great parents. Like I was in a culture set up to fall to a pornographic addiction. He put everything in his place, in my place, to fight against it.
As we sort of wrap the idea of technology and the current generation, we've mentioned several of them, but maybe just like whatever you can think of in terms of blockers and things like that. And then just big picture, what as a society, but then also as parents and as friends, what we can do to help this problem.
All right. So you want resources, and then you want like big picture vision.
Yeah. Like, so we've talked about society talking about it more.
Correct.
That's important. Parents need to talk about it more, right? We do want to lock things down. Are there? You've mentioned some, right? Like on the cell phone, on gaming devices, or getting rid of those even. Like, is there anything we haven't really touched on, kind of within those categories?
Yeah. One that comes to mind, and this is kind of a joke I made with Megan last night, but I've been thinking about it. Is like, I'm in my grass touching era. All right, so I just want to go out. I want to live life, because I realized I don't have social media on my cell phone. If I post something, it's because maybe she posts it for me or somebody else posts it for me. So like, I don't find myself getting wrapped up with my cell phone a lot. And so for me, and it seems like a lot of the importance of cognitive development is like, the less screen time, the better. Like, I don't think you should rip it away, right? Because I look fondly back at my childhood for enjoying video games. I had a lot of fun playing video games with friends, with my brothers. Like, that was a big bonding moment, and screaming moments. I'm not going to lie.
Right.
I don't understand why we would play one-player games when there were three of us and we had multiple like multiplayer option games. But right, so when I look at it, it's there's the protective pieces, right? So if a parent is really anxious and they're like, I want to have some form of connecting with my child if they're going to be away from me, one, I would encourage to try to like learn how to push through that and navigate your own emotion in that. But if you still want a protection, like Gap is a great resource. They make great cell phones with no access to social media. You have to add in the contacts. They have limited number of contacts. They pretty much can only call. They might be able to snap a picture. I don't think they can send or receive pictures. At least there's different levels to them. So that would be a great way to go about it resource-wise, because I think the less you can limit the screen time, like potentially the better, but the less you can like eliminate the like kind of like the doom scrolling, right? Of the Facebook reels, the Instagram reels, the YouTube shorts, the TikToks, like all of that stuff. Like I've had students come up to me and they're like, yeah, look at my average screen time from this past week. It was 18 hours. I'm like, bro, what are you doing? Go touch grass. Go touch grass, right? Because we look at millennials, right? They hung out a ton as teenagers, but they had cell phones. They had cell phones that they couldn't like doom scroll on. And when I say doom scroll, just like getting trapped into like a cycle of scrolling. They would just text each other to go hang out. They would call each other to go hang out. And I think that's that key difference there is helping out in that capacity. The more you can get kids out and interacting with each other, I mean, the less time they're going to have to watch pornography, right? And so, limiting it, they don't need to play all day Saturday playing video games. I had a friend of mine recently. He's like, yeah, dude, I remember when I would get up, play video games, and then go to bed.
Oh my gosh.
I'm like, I was a rural kid, so we didn't do that. Like our backyard was 25 acres. You best believe we went and had an adventure. And so there's that kind of element there. And again, not being uncomfortable with talking about the conversation, but also like reaching out to other parents and learning how to do it. So Gap phone is great. Needed Navigation is another great resource. If you need a female-specific resource, I recommend She Recovery is a podcast and a resource that For the life of me, I can't remember her name, but it's a girl-focused resource. Hey, how can you navigate this conversation with girls? Because I think there's a ton of resources for boys, but the girls, they're like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm floating out here. So there's that element. What's the Pure Desire Teen Boys one?
Top Gun.
Top Gun.
Yeah.
That one is what I'm going to try to navigate through with some boys next. Like, that's a good, those are great resources. And then Julia Slatterly, Authentic Intimacy, she has a lot of great resources on guiding parents and just encouraging through that. And then I'm trying to think of like the big picture here, right? Because is that the other element you wanted there?
Yeah, anything you talk to, parents bring their kids to you sometimes.
Yeah.
What would be helpful? Not that they shouldn't do that. We want external and internal resources. So they're bringing them to you. That's awesome.
Yeah.
What would also be helpful if they were doing it at home?
Yeah. So
just to complement both sides.
Yeah. Well, it's helpful if you evade like a shame-free environment, and it's any guarantee is, and evade your own shame. Right. I had a student who had an incident, and I just remember seeing the shame on the parent of like, man, did I really screw up this bad raising this kid? Mm-hmm. And my brain just being like, no, like this is just the brokenness of our world. Give yourself some grace. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of those elements is like you kind of evade the shame, not only for your child, but for yourself. Like remember that like when it comes to pornography, yes, it is inevitable. Like it's not your fault if like your kid gets access to it in some capacity, because the world is against them. The world wants them to have it because it's a product. It makes money. Unfortunately, it's one of the most. I think you combined the NHL, NFL, NBA, MLB. You combine that all together, and all major streaming services, they're still not making as much money as pornography. And so just kind of comfortable navigating that, having trying to have safe conversations around it, where it's like less of like the you shouldn't have done this and more like, hey, you're okay, let's talk about this language. I would encourage that in some capacity. And I think there's probably of value to talk on both sides. So it's like, if dad's the only one talking about it with the sons, which is good, dad definitely needs to step up and talk about it. But I think it might also be good for like to hear from the mom side for boys of like, hey, like this is something that negatively impacts me as well when I see you go through this. And so there's the perspective of like how it hits other people, and then also kind of trying to reinforce with a child that it's like, hey, more than anything, yes, this impacts others, but this deeply impacts you too. How you live your life. So I don't know if that fully answers the question. It's kind of ethereal, and I'm still developing my thoughts on that. But yeah,
definitely. And we'll put those resources in the show notes too. I know there's Pure Desire also has a new parent training. Yeah. So we'll put that in there too. And you mentioned another parent training. So if parents are listening, there's going to be a lot of links in the show notes to kind of help you out.
Yeah. Casey, it's as I'm sitting here listening to you talk, our journeys are relatively short, right? 4 years for me and Kylene, and you came in about 3 years, into that healing pattern, and it's really. I sit here in a not from a fatherly standpoint, but I'm really proud of how far you've come. It's because I remember that first day when you came into the groups and everything, and it's really, it's a great reminder for people to say, hey, you really can grow into this, and you can really speak, boldly about this, and it's actually okay. And the gifts that come, I always kind of go back through my memory. I haven't had one person critique me for talking about it, and the amount of people who, I was actually laughing about this the other day. Somebody reached out to me for some help on a situation, and I was like, how did that happen? How did we go from like just trying to work on my own woundedness and my own damage that I had done, kind of same for you. Now people are, you all of a sudden become an expert, and it's, I'm seeing you, as you're stepping into that and being there for people, it's really, really important. And, I'm thankful for doing that work.
I'm all about standing up and pointing out problems in society. That's part of being 25, right? It's usually like the world sucks and we need to fix it.
That's right. That's right.
But it's funny you say like nobody critiques you, right? Because I think of like there was a little anxiety of like, oh man, I'm the youth pastor here. Should I be going through these groups? Like I'm supposed to, like, I think I quickly, those were about 5 seconds worth of thoughts. Sure. And then I'm like, no, I went out of this. I don't like, I've been doing fine on my own, but I know I need a group. And one of my favorite pieces because I've made a couple social media posts about like my distaste towards it, how the Lord has grown me out of it. And I get more DMs from stuff like that than anything else. I'm a huge car guy, right? I would love to get DMs about when I post a photo of my car.
If you post anything about Legos, I'll DM you.
All right, let's do it. But no, when it comes to like pornography, I'm always getting people messaging me. I mean, I had this guy who, when I was a high schooler, I was trying to learn what it meant to disciple somebody. And so he was a 7th grader and we got along well. And I was like, all right, man, let's do this. Well, he messaged me when I put one on Post Up and he's like, dude, I want you to know your story's been so inspiring to me, right? Because you've shown me the Lord does give freedom in this. And I want that freedom too, and have been walking in that freedom. And so it's just cool how like, nobody's like, what are you doing? Like you're missing out on life for not watching porn. No, most people are like, no, this is good. This is good. Thank you.
I have one last question, and then Patrick, I don't know if you have another one, but is there one thing that when you were 8, that would have been helpful for you to hear?
It's okay. I think that would have been a good thing to hear. It's like you're not a monster. You're not broken. This doesn't make you dirty. Like because I think there was I didn't understand the connection until I was probably in my 20s between shame and pornography, and I just look at that and I flash back to that moment when I was trying to find those Power Ranger videos as a 6-year-old and then getting just swamped with shame because somebody in their own brokenness uploaded a video to a website they shouldn't have been uploading to. Like I just think about all the shame that I was wrapped up in as a little kid and not understanding. And I mean, I would love to go back and give my 8-year-old self a hug. I would love to do that. Lord willing, I don't know how he could do that, but if he wants to, he can figure it out for me. But that would for sure be like one thing. It's just like, hey man, it's okay. It's not the end of the world. We're gonna put our big boy pants on and we're gonna keep rolling. So
that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Thanks, Casey. Every day is a new chance to choose health and freedom. Make that choice today, and we'll see you next week.
Woohoo! If you're listening to this, it means you've made it through an entire episode. Part of recovery is spending time engaging in healing and self-growth activities. We are thankful that you chose our podcast to be one of those activities today. Make sure you reward yourself for that accomplishment. If you've enjoyed this episode or this podcast, we would love to hear from you. Please take just a few moments to leave a rating and review, letting us know your experience with Recover You. We not only love hearing how these episodes are helpful, but ratings and reviews help others just like you who are searching for recovery information and support find the podcast too. We can't wait to hear from you. See you next week.